That usually happens. Mike usually jumps on turntables and up for everybody.
Y2K, the turn of the century. The early 2000s was an odd and transitional period for the world at large, but especially in terms of the world of music. The angst of the 90s was still in full force, but much of the outward darkness was starting to fade off after a decade-long bender of music and media all about drug abuse, anti-religious protest, self-destruction, and an excessive embrace of ego. The 2000s became a time when much of that was beginning to die off, and pre-9/11, the direction of pop culture was more or less aimless. And no scene really encapsulated this better than nu metal. The genre that took the world by storm through the latter half of the 90s was not yet in decline, but much of the allure had begun to wear off. Most bands in that bubble who once embodied an underground culture now stood as pop star idols on MTV, relishing in their money and fame, with just about everyone involved quickly fading in popularity or entering their own little dark ages. So if the genre was going to survive in this new era, it was going to take a reinvention of sorts to make that happen. And that change did actually come. But there's only really one band who I can point to single-handedly shift the tides and keep the genre alive. And that little band was Linkin Park. Carving their own unique niche side by side with what came before, not due to any revolution or desire to dissociate, but solely through their ambitions of pushing beyond the pale and into a new league of greatness, LP did just that, changing the game and reaching even bigger heights than many of their predecessors ever could. Despite all the memes, the pitfalls of their career, or many rebrandings and genre flips, the band consistently stayed at the top of the food chain and pushed out forward-thinking and experimental releases that have stayed influential even all of these years later. And despite how much time passes, no record seems to get more attention than the beloved and amazing Hybrid Theory, the band's debut and to this day most popular release. Hybrid Theory is a bit of an album of legend, not only in its sales and staying power, but its influence is still really strongly felt to this day. It served as both a culmination of all that had come before it, as well as a rebirth in many ways, pushing new ideas, new aesthetics, and possibly the most radio-friendly identity that nu metal had seen yet. All of this even sparked a bit of a debate whether this record could even be considered nu metal at all, but hey, I'm starting to get a little bit ahead of myself. So why don't we put on our trip pants, get some frosted tips, and show the world how misunderstood we really were. Let's talk about how Hybrid Theory changed everything.
Hi guys, how are you?
Hi. Hello. Good.
Hi. Hello. So as the people out there might not know you at present, we've got to start with all these basic questions like for what's Linkin Park? Was it a place where you hung around?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, Linkin Park?
Don't address any questions to him.
Okay.
He's not really guy.
Obviously, with a group like Linkin Park, if we just jump into the debut, we'll be missing many of the important details needed to fully understand how we ended up with an album like Hybrid Theory. So why don't we take it from the top? Originally formed under the name Zero, This iteration of the band would be the brainchild of Los Angeles natives Mike Shinoda, Brad Delson, and Rob Burton in 1996. The trio were in high school at the time, and with their shared interest in music, they created a group called Zero. However, production on this project wouldn't really come to fruition until they graduated. That would be when they would fill out their lineup with Joe Hahn and Dave Farrell. This group of rejects would end up being the initial lineup of the group, and responsible for many of the early demos that we would hear from Linkin Park. Though with their limited resources, it was predominantly done in the makeshift studio of Mike Shinoda, recruiting original vocalist Mark Wakefield around the same time to fill up the sung vocals. An important thing to note here is that despite all the members being high school age, this wasn't their first rodeo in playing with bands. Zero was largely made up of the broken pieces of previous projects, Mike being a longtime MC and producer, as well as Mark, Rob, and Brad formerly playing together in a band called Relative Degree, which Rob described as being similar to 311. So already having some experience in writing and collaborating allowed for the early days of Zero to be a bit smoother and more productive than if this was everyone's first time clashing egos and attempting to put something together. The resulting EP, after a year of writing and recording, would be a self-titled demo cassette, probably most famous for its uncanny and ugly album art. And while this might be a bit more of an obscure part of the band's history to non-diehards, it actually is one of the most crucial pieces of their history. Most of the tracks here would be reworked numerous times for future releases, and if there's any real takeaway from the Zero project, it's that it really does set the roots for the band's future far better than most other nu metal acts did. Where Korn's early years as LAPD had a very different and at times unrecognizable sound, or even the primitive style of early Slipknot only vaguely resembling what would come later, the Zero EP just sounds like Linkin Park if they were some small local act with no real recording budget. Sure, it's definitely not on par with their later work, but more so, the sound was already here. The early hybrid of metal and hip-hop that's on display was far more cohesive than anything that really came before it. Keep in mind, this was 1997, and we had barely just got to see Limp Bizkit debut, and only a other handful of hip-hop rock hybrids had really happened outside of Rage Against the Machine. This is a major reason why Linkin Park always sounded different from the nu metal pack, and had such a divorced take on the genre. What would actually inspire the marriage of the genres was a show that Mike Shinoda attended at 15, seeing Anthrax on their Attack of the Killer Bees tour, where he would be exposed to their genre-mashed material of the late 80s, as well as Public Enemy. When we started, we wanted to play something that we weren't hearing. The first show I went to was Anthrax and Public Enemy. They did Bring the Noise together, and I was like, that's the most amazing thing I've ever heard. Everybody in our band, and our fans too, has just been raised on different styles of music. Everybody's mixing everything. When you hear Redman do a song with Ronnie Size or Busta Rhymes with Ozzy, you know something's happening. Well, stuff like this. Might sound pretty far removed from a collaboration between Ozzy and Busta Rhymes. It does make sense how someone inspired by these artists who formed a band with somebody like Mr. Han, who is a big fan of Big Beat and Aphex Twin, Zero sounding the way that they do makes perfect sense. Now, to address the mark-shaped elephant in the room, the lack of Chester made for a much different feel. Mike's raps here were far more prominent and technical than what would come later, and it makes a lot of the early material feel more clunky and off in retrospect. But regardless, what's here is still impressive, especially for a demo by musicians as young as these guys. The song Rhinestone, which would later be turned into Forgotten, shows this off more than any other. Clean vocalist Mark Wakefield would be a decent vocalist for the group, but it was clear that he wasn't as confident of a vocalist as he needed to be, and his takes are a lot more subdued, and his overall presence feels more like it's there purely to support Mike. A contrast to the give-and-take nature of the band's later work with Chester. But overall, this demo is an interesting piece of the band's history. And while recordings can sound a bit crude for being done in a bedroom studio during the 90s, it does show just how early on the band was striking at that core sound that would define them in just a few short years, with the experimental DIY spirit being the project's main driver. So I started the band. The first songs were at the end of high school, me and Mark Wakefield. After that, we started to get a little interest and encouragement from this guy who worked at the label. So we started recording more in my house and playing some shows once a month or once every couple of months. We were practicing once or twice a week and recording once or twice a week. I didn't have time to do more than that. The further I got through school, towards the end, the workload lightens up a bit, and I was really good at consolidating my work. If I needed to make an album cover for us, like we had these demo cassettes that we'd hand out, CD burners where were really unreliable at that point. We didn't have the money to burn a whole bunch of them, but cassettes were cheap. So we'd send it over to the guy and he'd make a bunch of cassettes and they'd look professional. And everybody had cassette players. I was making the art for one of those, and one of my school projects was kind of an open-ended design project. We're going to use these techniques, but whatever you make with the techniques, you can make whatever you want to make. So I do my project, and that would be the cover on the thing. So I was killing two birds with one stone, trying to be efficient. But this DIY spirit wouldn't be what would propel the band into fame and fortune. Rather, Zero would end up struggling to gather any real audience at all, with their shows being a bit rough and most of the support only coming from their friends and other local bands. Though names to note here would be fellow up-and-comers at the time, Incubus and Hoobastank. This lack of attention and inability to gain any real attention from labels would become a big deterrent to some of the members of the band, but most importantly, it would be a huge one to Mark Wakefield. And this would all come to a head in 1998. After 2 years of hard work and only inches of progress realistically being made here, it was a showcase at the Whiskey A Go-Go for scouts to sign bands that would ultimately end up going about as bad as it could. Not long before this event, guitarist Brad Delson would be able to introduce the band to Jeff Blue, the vice president of A&R for the label Zomba Music, who wouldn't sign the band but would act as a bit of an advisor. This showcase at the Whiskey was something that he vehemently protested against, but alas, the band really wanted to see it through. Showing up late and having quite a few technical issues, all while performing material that hadn't yet reached commercial viability, it would result in the band receiving 7 rejections and multiple staff at labels being fired due to their interest in the group and affiliations with Jeff Blue. The main point of criticism outside of the unprofessional nature of the show and technical issues was actually Mark's vocals, and this would result in him being ousted from the group. Mark and I started my band, our band, together. Eventually, he wasn't a singer. He would get crazy ulcers and stuff from the stress of doing band stuff. Having to get on stage made him physically nauseous. Then he went into management. He's really good at a lot of stuff and has to do with music. And so he ends up managing, basically number 2 at the management company, at that company Velvet Hammer, who who manages System of a Down, who he loves, Alice in Chains, who he also loved, Deftones. Like, talk about a dream job, just working with bands that you love. Quite the wordsmith there, Mike. But while the band would suffer this issue, they would still forge on. And this would mark the end of their time as Zero, with the tides finally turning in their favor not long after.
It's one thing to question answers and to be rebellious, right? And they're two different things. Right. To question answers and to be rebellious. This is more about questioning. I found. I'm not telling you. That's what I'm thinking. Is that the case for you? Because a lot of it, it seems like you are saying, this is what you told me. Runaway is a song where you say, all right, here's what I thought it was, or what you told me it was. It ain't like that anymore, right? So I want to talk to you about the mood of this record and the fact that there is a lot of questioning for the sake of not being rebellious, but learning.
I definitely think that being rebellious is a part of life, but if you really want to be a rebel, then you question everything that comes up to you and not go out and try to fight it, but try to understand it and learn it. And that's really how you can understand it and consciously make the right decision to question it the right way.
After ousting Wakefield from the band, Zero would go through a pretty rough period of time trying to restructure the group into something much more cohesive, though this would be a bit of a dead end considering their lack of a second vocalist. Zero attempted to find a replacement but couldn't really find the missing link they were looking for. Mike Shinoda even tried to restructure the whole group into something that let him be the sole frontman, but this only led to middling results at best. When we did shows, I'd get friends to do the other vocals. It was really fun. It's strange though. Whenever I've written vocals, I've always written them with two people in mind. I think it adds a cool depth and vibe to the songs. Now, around the same time over in Phoenix, Arizona, a band called Gray Days was about to come to its end. Gray Days was the band Chester Bennington belonged to before his time with Linkin Park. The project had become a bit of a local legend to the Arizona scene as they spent 1993 through 98 playing shows and opening up for many national touring acts, building a dedicated fan base. But the band's music can best be described as 90s grunge by the number, with a large influence of alternative as well. A far cry from the output of Zero, but something that actually makes a lot of sense given Chester's vocal style. Gray Days would also go through their own issues with getting signed and eventually would opt to go on an indefinite hiatus once Chester left due to creative differences. And thanks to the connections the band had to Jeff Blue, Chester would be referred to Zero as a possible new vocalist. What made Chester such an enticing choice for Mike and crew was his years of experience as a frontman, especially since Mark Wakefield had such bad stage fright that it caused him to struggle to perform. Chester would eventually be contacted about joining up with Zero. This was after a long period of rejections and inability to find a new project, so he was already on the verge of either giving up or desperately giving in to any project that would take him. When he received a tape containing the band's demos, he initially listened to the instrumentals and was very impressed by how different and forward-thinking the whole thing was, only to be put off by the songs that did have vocals on them. But once he heard the band mostly consisted of teenagers, his doubts would more than get the best of him, as he would have a lot of second thoughts on if he should join or not, ultimately giving in and giving it a shot. I noticed that Mike's rapping was really good, and I felt I could improve on their melodies as far as where their choruses were concerned. Something did tell me that, yeah, this is the one. This is the golden ticket inside of Willy Wonka's chocolate factory.
Yeah, I got a demo in the mail, and then I pretty much just kind of fell in love with it instantly, and then went in and canceled all of my plans for the entire day, and called my friend at the studio, said I need a couple hours, and went in there, cut the demo, called him I think about 12 hours after the demo arrived in my house, and said I'm ready. And they were pretty surprised about that.
And within 24 hours, I got a demo in the mail.
Once the decision to join was made, he would work with some of his local contacts and quickly produce vocals for the instrumentals that he was given. Upon completion, he would beg Jeff Blue to come hear them, refusing to mail the recordings, eventually opting to play the songs over the phone just so he could get Jeff's reaction. What I heard floored me. Every crack of his voice had a story to tell. It was iconic, genuine, vulnerable, urgent, beautiful, and it hit you in the gut. I immediately called Brad and Mike and told them I was flying Chester out to Los Angeles. Jeff Blue, extremely impressed with what he had heard, Jeff invited Chester to LA to audition for Zero, and from there, the rest is history. Upon joining the band, they would see another name change, now going under Hybrid Theory, a suggestion from Johan.
What we've been doing kind of in our little cave is just continuing to refine our sound. We don't want people to listen to our song and go, okay, this is the hip hop part, okay, that's the rock influence. We don't want to be rock/rap. We want to be Hybrid Theory. We want people to hear our sound and identify that by the name of our band.
It's mixed media, baby.
While the band still struggled to gain the attention of labels, they also struggled with another issue. Bassist Dave Farrell had left a void in the band after taking some time away to focus on another project called The Snacks. Without him, they would go through a host of different bassists during this time, adding to the turmoil that the project would face. Regardless, they would develop a new demo with Chester, and their self-titled EP that would come out from this would finally be their ticket to success. Continuing the odd theme of creepy-looking babies being painted for the album art, this demo would be a massive step ahead of the previous Zero material, still containing songs that would later be reworked for their debut full-length, but this time much closer to the final form that we would all come to know and love them as. While info on these recording sessions is pretty sparse, it was the first time the band had officially recorded in an actual studio and not self-produced from Mike's bedroom. And this is instantly apparent when you hear how this whole thing sounds.
You're killing me and a DJ in the group just for credibility. I heard that some of you were getting help with your rhymes. You're not an MC if someone else writes your lines. Rapping over rock doesn't make you a pioneer, cause rock and hip hop.
The hip hop portions on this EP far exceed what came later. And this was more than likely due to Mike's time alone, writing without a second vocalist, developing the skill he needed to handle a project solo. That being said, once you hear Chester on this thing, it makes it all really come together into the Linkin Park signature sound that's been absent from all their previous work thus far.
Anger's a gift, then I guess I've been blessed.
Now this is Linkin Park. This is the band that we would come to know and love, and don't get it twisted, I'm not saying Chester magically made the band just by being there, but more so he was the missing piece of the puzzle, bringing that dynamic the band was trying to find since its inception. It was this iteration of the project that would finally help garner them attention. And with the EP's polished sound, it would be a great piece to shop around to labels, especially after years of rejections due to shoddy recordings, poor live performances, and the overall uncommercialability of the band. But the time they spent with Jeff Blue and all the hard work they had put in would finally begin to pay off, as in 1999, Jeff would be hired as vice president of A&R by Warner Brothers Records, and he would make Hybrid Theory his very first signing.
Suffered this rumor that's been going around the industry that you're a manufactured boy band.
You guys have a lot of people watching, and we get to say to all these people that we wouldn't have gotten a publishing deal first if we didn't write our own songs. So that rumor you heard is not true.
And not only that, but it's kind of hard to manufacture a band that knew each other their entire lives.
Try to find one record industry executive that can manufacture a piece of crap like us.
Hybrid Theory is one of those records that's highly debated on whether or not it belongs to the nu metal genre. And while I definitely think that it does, that doesn't really downplay how different it was from everything else at the time. Coincidentally, this was one of the main sticky points of the band in their struggle to get signed, with Brad Delson even recounting later that for the first few years, the first couple of years trying to get a record deal, people were telling us pretty much that we weren't great and that we should change our approach and be more like the groups that were already popular. That was exactly what we didn't want to do, and we stuck to our guns. We wrote the record that we wanted to write. In retrospect, this whole thing is extremely ironic because it was these genre-defying breaks that the band would ride to success with. Many labels saw their takes on the rap metal hybrid and thought it was too different from the Limp Bizkits and Rage Against the Machines of the world. Now, being signed might have given the band a lot of hope and promise, especially after many years of searching for acceptance and trying to get attention that they needed. But the last big hurdle that the band would have to climb through was once again shifting their name, this time to Linkin Park. Initially, they had some cringier ideas in mind, like Pleer and Platinum Lotus Foundation, which I think would have really hurt them more than anything if they chose them, whereas Linkin Park is just a very marketable and memorable name, and even the way it's spelled wrong, it sticks with you even more, even if that choice only came due to a desire to gain a domain name.
It's a place in Santa Monica in Los Angeles. It's named after the American president, Abraham Lincoln. We spelled it differently so that we could get the web domain name for a far cheaper price.
When it came time to write and record their debut, Linkin Park had already had much of what they needed, given that they had about half a decade's worth of songs to workshop into an album. Outside of the obvious boost in production value, many of the songs' lyrics would be written to fit tighter with the music and hold much more catchy choruses, taking on lyrical themes of abuse, relationships, drug addiction, and self-hatred. While the band did produce some cheesy and silly lines, overall it was definitely a step above some of their nu metal brethren. I mean, this is just truly breathtaking. And this lyrical content is instantly apparent from the band's first ever single, One Step Closer, a song that would come to be a massive hit for them. It was an obvious evolution of the typical nu metal sound, but much more streamlined and not nearly as abrasive and heavy as others, even containing a pop element with its catchiness. The lyrics also were something that spoke to many when it came out. I find the answers aren't so clear. Wish I could find a way to disappear. All these thoughts, they make no sense. I found bliss in ignorance. Nothing seems to go away over and over again. The nods to self-doubt and oppressive thoughts distorting your view of the world and pushing you closer to the proverbial edge might be a bit cliche to talk about now, but at the time, not many bands would speak on this, and it's something that just about anyone could really relate to. Feeling like a prisoner to your own mind and keeping yourself locked down either in an ignorant bliss or overthinking it until you're a mess of anxiety and neuroticism. Now, to go non-linear a little bit, the first actual song on the record is Paper Cut, and it would be a complete disservice for me to skip over it, as it not only introduces us to the record, but it also works as a bit of a showcase for the band's core sound. Specifically, the evolved version of that same sound that we heard back in 1997 with their original demo. It all just oozes with style and originality, giving Mike center stage in the beginning to not only show off his 90s style flow, but also deliver bars that would be far different from other nu metal bands who indulged in the same hip-hop style. I know I've got a face in me points out all my mistakes to me. You've got a face on the inside too, and your paranoia is probably worse. I don't know what set me off first, but I know what I can't stand. It's a far cry from the traditional braggadocious raps of Limp Bizkit or even Head PE, tackling the topic of self-doubt, but this time in the form of paranoia. Though to overanalyze a Linkin Park song a bit, it seems like the lyrics are pointing more so at the shadow self, a Jungian concept that points to the dark and evil side of ourselves that lives in the areas we repress, and how that same shadow self constantly barks at us and plants seeds of negativity and doubt, trying to escape and take control. The short story The Curious Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde explores this concept almost literally, and as fantastical as it can sound, it is a philosophical concept that pretty accurately describes the way repression can affect us, and as these lyrics nod, make the day feel like night. The music also reflects this greatly with its use of atmosphere, and to gush about one of the undersung heroes of Linkin Park, Joe Hahn's scratching and synth work really pushes this entire record to the next level, bringing in so much texture and elevating the guitar playing and vocal performances to an entirely new degree. Without it, much of the record would feel so much more bland and lifeless. Points of Authority is another track that indulges in the pop elements of the band. While it definitely sits with a heavier tone than some of the other tracks on the record, Chester's vocals soar with pop sensibilities that really take the whole thing more radio-friendly and infectious. The chorus is a total earworm for the matter, and they make the bitter lyrics about an abusive relationship go down much easier than genre-mate Korn ever could have. Though my personal favorite song off the record is the overplayed and beloved Crawling. And I don't care if the song has been played to hell and back, or if there is a fucking zone animation of Raven finger blasting herself to it. It's still a phenomenal track. It's got the hallmarks of a classic LP song, with Chester's fantastic singing, atmospheric synths, and subtle but tasteful guitar work, and that specific Linkin Park synth patch.
There's something inside me that pulls beneath the surface, consuming, confusing, this lack of self-control I fear.
Even if it's just another song about an abusive relationship, it's a fantastic one that definitely earned its radio play back in the day. Runaway, on the other hand, is a song that changes the whole speed of the record, bringing in an even more experimental sound, taking a stab at that tone that would later be expanded on with many of the tracks on their sophomore record, Meteora.
Paper bags and angry voices under a sky of dust. Another wave of tension has more than filled me up. On my talk of taking
Its lyrics also indulge in the more experimental side of things, with a larger emphasis on metaphors in the verses. And musically, it even contains sounds similar to what you would hear on some of Celldweller's self-titled record. Another great track is By Myself, which is actually the first song I ever heard from the band that would instantly make me a fan for life. By Myself is one of those tracks that might not be in every fan's top 5, but to me it really hits the nail on the head.
Don't you? I can't tell you how to make it. No matter what I do, how hard I can't seem to convince myself. I'm stuck on the outside. Don't you? I can't tell you how.
What makes this whole track work so well is its dynamics and stop-and-go nature, containing the typical back and forth between Chester and Mike, while also allowing the music to breathe between being a heavy track and a slower, more atmospheric one. The quality of the song probably stems from the fact that it happened to appear on some of the band's earlier demos. It had numerous rewrites and additions before finally making it onto the record. It's also one of those songs that break past the relationship issues and self-hatred that the majority of the record speaks on, and this time talks about drug abuse and dependence. And before we get to the end of this record, we do need to talk about the band's most well-known hit, In the End.
I tried so hard and got so far, but in the end, it doesn't even matter.
Look, I'm not going to spend too much time on the song itself because not only has this been played to absolute death, it's been memed to hell and back.
One game, I don't know why. I bought a PS5 with no games to buy. Keep that in mind, they designed this drive to improve loading times, that's all I know.
This song can almost single-handedly define the Y2K era. The pop-coded edginess, the light and dark paradigm, the cheesy rap verses, it's all there. And despite my mocking, it still is a solid track, and it's honestly very easy to see just why it became as popular as it did. While Hybrid Theory as an album did amazing and probably still would have been successful, it was this song that really pushed it beyond the pale. It's quite possible that without the star power granted to the band from this song, their influence and legendary status may never have come. Though, as I've made pretty clear, it is far from the best track on the record. Now, the original version of this album would usually come to a close with Pushing Me Away. A somber yet upbeat conclusion to the record. Some might see it as Numb version 1, with the song having a similar structure and sound, but it's far different and honestly a great track in its own right. But if I'm being honest, it's not as conclusive of an ending as what you would probably expect from a record closer, especially after an album as solid as this one. But this was actually something that the special editions of the album would fix. 2 extra songs were included, the even mopier and honestly far more conclusive sounding My December, as well as the amazing hip-hop focused High Voltage.
I've been digging in the crates ever since I was living in space. Before the rat race, before monkeys had human traits. I mastered numerology and Big Bang theology. Performed lobotomies with telekinetic psychology.
In my opinion, High Voltage is the true album closer, because it just cuts all the bullshit and goes in, with angry and bitter lyrics describing the harsh feelings of knowing how great you are and your work really is, it being left in the dust, and desiring nothing more than to prove yourself and crush the people in your way. A track of bitter triumph in the face of all the band's critics and the industry as a whole that doubted and tried to throw them away. It's conclusive because it feels like the finishing piece, not only closing out the record of Hybrid Theory, but really giving a conclusion to the idea and setting the record straight before the band would embark on a very prosperous career and developing a large legacy that is still felt to this day. Linkin Park would see some outstanding success, and even if we throw away the stats here, the sheer amount of references, memes, and adoration still found today, I think really speaks for itself, especially when you look at just how deep their own fan-made wiki is. The amount of archival channels on YouTube and fan groups that exist, Linkin Park was a huge deal, and Hybrid Theory was the record that made it all happen. While I might be someone who prefers Meteora, and some fans might even think records like Minutes to Midnight were their peak, it's safe to say that the band really does owe it all to their debut. And because of it, they were able to not only break through the underground and into the mainstream, but obtain a legacy and importance that will stand the test of time, as Linkin Park continues to make waves years after Chester's passing. Before even making their second LP, they would actually follow Hybrid Theory up with an amazing remix record, containing appearances from artists big and small from industrial, nu metal, electronic, and even hip-hop backgrounds. Some of these faces would even include Marilyn Manson, The Alchemist, Jonathan Davis, Jay Gordon, and even the Humble Brothers. And this isn't even mentioning the waves that they made as a touring act. So, before we end things, let me just say, rest in peace, Mr. Bennington. The work you did with the boys was amazing, and the fantastic collection of music we've been left with will always stand as some of the best that music has to offer. Now, before I sign off, I'd like to actually say thank you to the generous pay piggies who make it all possible. As most of you already know, anytime I talk about music on this channel, I mostly get demonetized. So support and funding from those who want to see more of this content is what keeps this channel going. I'm truly grateful to all those who are here on the wall of shame, and I appreciate each and every one of you. Now, if any of you dear viewers would like to show your support, links to my Patreon and Ko-fi are in the description. But with that being said, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, and I'll see you in the next video.